So, welcome everyone who's joining us today for this virtual launch of our new Boiler House Press Recovered Books series edition of Christopher Burney's remarkable memoir. And really to call it a memoir is to sort of short change it, but Solitary Confinement. Joining us today, we have uh, Christopher's son, Peter, as well as Hugh Purcell, who was Christopher's biographer and who contributed the afterword to our edition of the book. Um, we'll start with just talking about how the book came to be part of the Recovered Books series. So Peter and Hugh and Peter joining us today. My passion for many years has been reading and writing about and celebrating books that have just unjustly become fallen out of print and been critically neglected. I started this site, the Neglected Books page, in 2006, and one of the very first books that I wrote about was Solitary Confinement, and that's because it was a book that once I discovered it, I kept with me for years. I probably first read it in the early 90s, and it was such a strikingly interesting book. I think that's one of the things that I have most a passion for in terms of where we go with the Recovered Book series is to try to not fit into one particular genre and not fit into one particular historical period, but to really find books that on their own have substantial merit and really need to be kept into the critical discourse and into our cultural history and literary history. And Solitary Confinement, in my mind, is certainly in that category. So, and I'm very fortunate that at the time it was still possible to get copies of the book. So I have a first edition, which has become, and one of the other reasons that I wanted to publish this book is that even though it's been reissued a number of times, it's become, people who know about solitary confinement get copies, buy copies for friends, and it became increasingly difficult just to find a copy, even a used copy for any reasonable price. And it's a book that has inspired people to reissue it. So the first time it was first published in 1952. This edition, sadly, was from a publisher who quickly went out of business after issuing the first edition. That doesn't help a book, of course. One of the things I find for the books that we reissue is very often it's just simple bad luck more than anything. It's not a good book. It's just it has bad breaks. So Macmillan reissued the book or published a book under their imprint in 1961. It got, in fact, an editorial notice in the Times Literary Supplement, but went out of print again. And this edition actually got a fair amount of attention, almost more attention than when the 52 edition came out. So Rebecca West published a very enthusiastic review in the Daily Telegraph when that came out in 61. It was then reissued again by Macmillan, combined with a shorter book that Christopher Burney wrote shortly after his release from Buchenwald, called The Dungeon Democracy. And this was in 1984, I think this was reissued. Unfortunately, the book has been out of print since then, so 40 years. Um, since then, Hugh Purcell and Margaret Percy wrote a fascinating book about Christopher, kind of the parallel lives and tragedies of Christopher Burney and his brother Roger, who joined the Free French forces and was involved in a disastrous accident involving an interesting ship, the Surcouf which was sort of a combat, sort of surface combat submarine, which was an interesting vessel. They don't make those now, I think, for reasons that turned out to have difficulties. Uh, but what really triggered me was we had launched this recovered book series in 2021 with a book called Gentlemen Overboard by Herbert Clyde Lewis. And I had a running list. I still keep a running list of candidates for the series. And this was on the list. And it was only, though, when Ted Gioia, an American writer, a former professor from Stanford, who's written particularly a lot about music, wrote about it on his Substack blog, The Honest Broker, in 2023. And that kind of triggered me to say, let's take a look at this again, because I think this is really a timely book. Um, people having gone through the experience of living in lockdowns, and that sort of sense of enforced solitary confinement, I think people are much more receptive to the ideas that Christopher Burney explores in his own book. And so that kind of triggered me to track down, and I got a hold of Peter Burney. Peter connected me with Juliet, who's providing the capability to uh, reissue to get the rights to the book, as well as to a shorter piece that Christopher Burney wrote in the first in the 60s, and then kind of republished again in the 80s, Descent from Ararat. So we're now in a position to say this book, fortunately, is back in print as it deserves to be. I hope we've done it justice in our packaging of it, both in terms of the design and editorial approach. So Ted Joyous very generously allowed us to use his essay as an introduction, and Hugh Purcell very wonderfully offered to write a piece that actually sits both as an afterword and as an introduction to Dungeon Democracy, or not Dungeon Democracy, to Descent from Ararat, the shorter version of that story. And so what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Hugh for a few minutes. And Hugh, tell us, how was it that Christopher Burney ended up in France and was captured by the Gestapo and imprisoned, and the basis of this solitary confinement?
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, which I found very well illustrated. Yes, well, Christopher had bummed around Europe in the 30s, having run away from school. And he spent a long time in Paris, and he spoke fluent French, and he loved France. And he joined up in the Second World War as a soldier and fought in a long forgotten campaign called the Narvik campaign. But at the end of that, his former commander, Gubbins, started the commandos, and Christopher joined one of the early commandos, but he still wasn't satisfied. He still wasn't seeing any action. And he took it, he believed that he wrote to Gubbins that surely there ought to be a presence behind enemy lines carrying out subversion and resistance work. This was very early on in the war, just after France had fallen, probably 1940. Well, greater minds than his had had a similar idea. And that is how the Special Operations Executive came into being. Churchill backed it, saying to Gubbins, "Now you must set Europe ablaze." And Christopher was one of the first recruits. It was, I have to say, a ramshackle organization in those days. After a while, he was dropped into France, and just as an indication, they had no maps as to how to get from A to B. They were using tourist maps. But I'm just going slightly ahead of it. Christopher was trained by the SOA, and in 1942, he was briefed to drop into Normandy by parachute and go to Caen, Caen, which is near the sea, and join a resistance group, one of the very first ones called Autogiro, started by a Frenchman called Pierre de Vomcourt. And he was to meet a contact in Caen and report back on what was going on. And the idea then was that there would probably be, looking back on it now, it was wishful thinking, some kind of Allied landing in France in early 1943. And by having got together a resistance group carrying out subversion, they would meet up with the sort of at least mini invasion. Anyway, now this is where the disaster struck. When when Christopher, having landed by parachute with a colleague and made his way to Caen, he observed that the house where he was going to meet his contact was being watched by the Gestapo. So he didn't make himself known. And he contacted a woman, his other contact there. And then after a while, he discovered that the whole of Autogiro had already been wound up, captured, and he was on his own. To quote the official historian of SOE, he was a headless chicken. Now, the question was, and been debated ever since, did SOE know that Autogiro had been wound up before they got him dropped into France? Christopher certainly thought so when he got back. He told his wife, Julia, that Churchill had to be impressed by what SOE was doing, and he was absolutely on his own. He was the only one actually having the Autogiro having been wound up. They needed someone to say, oh, SOE is busy in North France. I should say one other very important thing at this stage, that it was very early on, and SOE had hardly any wireless transmitters. So the only way they could get message back to England was actually through a contact in Lyon, an American woman, actually. She would get messages back through the diplomatic bag, and then they'd be phoned through to England. So it was a long time after Autogiro was wound up before message got back to England. And actually, it only got back in the late May, and Christopher was dropped on May the 30th. So whether SOE knew is, I don't know. Christopher certainly thought they did, but I won't say that is proven. It might have been that SOE thought that it had been wound up, but sent Christopher in nevertheless just to make sure and see if anything could be picked up out of the ruins. I mean, that was what SOE was like. It took, throughout its history, it took extraordinary risks, and many of its brave men, and particularly women, were caught, betrayed at various stages. I should say that Autogiro had been betrayed really by a woman called Mathilde Carré, who was known as the Cat, who was a double agent. but that's another story. So Christopher survived in Paris on his own. His one contact was the brother of a girl he'd been out with years before when he was in France earlier on. And it was only a matter of time before he was picked up by the Gestapo. It was probably because when he went to change his food rations, there was some error in his papers. Now, that was, again, quite typical in the early days of SOE. they were pretty erratic in not only what they sent with their warrior sent with their agents, but whether it was accurate or not. Anyway, he was hanging around, and the woman disappeared behind the counter. Said, "Just wait a minute." And when she came back, she served him as usual. But a few days, only 2 days later, he was woken up in his bedroom in the hotel. He turned down the suggestion of having a suicide pill. He had handed in his gun to his friend, and he put up a resistance, but it was no good. And he was then taken off to the Rue d'Assassinat, the Gestapo headquarters, and he was very brutally tortured. Being a very clever guy, and I think quite a sort of, he adopted a devious scheme where he had various various answers which would evade the truth that he was in SOE. He would give away quite a lot that was true, but not that was important. And in the end, the Gestapo couldn't prove that he was in SOE, but he was taken off to Fresnes jail. And the German who took him off and had attended his interrogation said, "Well, you put up a good show, Christophe Brunet, that was his code name, but I don't believe a word of it." And he was sent to rot in Fresnes jail. So how's that for now, Brad?
Yeah. I mean, I think a question that would occur to many people who read this is how is it that I mean, that doesn't seem like a typical end story for someone who gets captured by the Gestapo, that they throw him in a cell and then almost forget about him for over a year.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. This was the early days of not only SOE, but the early days of the German occupation of France. And there was the Vichy regime next door under the Frenchman Pétain. And I think, having read around this subject a lot in the last few years, because I've become fascinated, things got a lot more brutal in the last over the next 2 years. It's brutal enough, Christopher, but I think probably my own view was that if he'd been captured a year later, he would have been executed. But whether they could have proved that he was from SOE or not, they wouldn't have bothered. But as it was, he was just sort of bunged into the cell. And Fred, he thought he would be executed. He thought he was going to be taken out every day. And after another bout of interrogation, he would be shot. And one of his ruminations in solitary confinement is what it means, as it were, to be shot, and how you should describe about it in that you no longer exist, as it were.
Right.
I didn't put that very well, but anyway, he certainly expected he would be executed.
Right. I mean, that's I always like when we look at things from a historical standpoint, one of the things we lose is the fact that people who are in the moment don't know how it's going to come out. And one of the things that's fascinating is that Christopher does deal frankly with the fact that he didn't know on the first day he was going to be in this cell that it was going to be this prolonged solitary confinement. He didn't know that he wouldn't be dragged out and shot or continue to be subjected to torture and questioning. So
No, he had no.
he doesn't know that, and that's kind of one of the things that makes his reflections so powerful in my mind.
Yes, indeed. And just to get down to the practicality of it all, he was in solitary, I think, for 526 days. There's a picture on the cover of Solitary Confinement, as indeed in my book, of the sort of cell he was in. And he only got out of that cell, well, he changed cells, but he only got out to the exercise yard on a very small number of occasions. He had no change of clothes. He had no books for the first year, no pen. He was completely on his own. And as he described so graphically in Solitary Confinement, he spent almost the whole time starved. I mean, his description of how he combated hunger. He was given a very weak gruel and 2 pieces of bread. And he knew if he was going to survive, he had to leave 1 piece of bread until the evening. His description of how he had this sort of self-discipline most of the time to last the whole day, how sometimes he gave in and then burst into tears at his lack of resolution, how he hid the bread round his cell so he thought he couldn't find it, and how it was the relief if he had a piece of bread and went to sleep on it and could feel it sort of gestating in his stomach. But he spent all that time, as I say, apart from occasional attempts, successful attempts to get food taken in from other cells by being hauled down on a pulley by a prisoner in the cell above. But he was spent most of the time cold, half-starved, and it was he only survived because of his extraordinary self-discipline and his ruminations, which are the wonderful triumph of solitary confinement, so that at the end, he said he'd actually established a kind of serenity because he had achieved what they called in Buchenwald later a state of anomie. He divorced himself from the reality of his cell, and he was living in his mind. And that led him to this extraordinary serenity in Buchenwald, which was remarked on, which enabled him to survive.
Right. Well, let's touch on that for a moment. So when he did finally was finally pulled out of solitary confinement, his next destination wasn't really any better, was it?
No. He was pulled out of Fresnes. This was the summer of 43, because the Allies were, sorry, it was 44. The Allies were about to take France. And so he went in a cattle truck for 3 days with hardly any sustenance and hardly any air to Buchenwald, which was a concentration camp in Weimar. The difference between a concentration camp and an extermination camp like Treblinka or Chelmno or Sobibor or Auschwitz was that actually the laborers were worked to death. They weren't put in a gas chamber. But there were 50,000 deaths in Buchenwald over the war, 50,000. And the rate of death increased a huge amount towards the end of the war, when Jews came in, having been driven across Germany in open trucks to avoid the advancing Russians. And well, Christopher, I mean, I think the other reason why Christopher survived, apart from his extraordinary self-discipline, was that in the 30s, when he had been wandering around Europe as a rather unhappy but restless and adventurous schoolboy, or at least teenager, he had learnt languages. He spoke German and French and a smattering of Russian and certainly Spanish. So he got himself a job as an interpreter. And that meant that he could roam around the camp, picking off what food and what warmth there was that was going. And I think that saved his life. And he became a leader, actually, of the non-communist resistance. But he was extremely lucky to survive. Towards the end of the war, when the Americans were advancing, the order came out to execute Christopher and a number of other. There was only 4 Brits who survived, and he he was hidden under the floorboards of a cab for 48 hours by his Russian friends, with the prisoners trampling up and down above him on the floorboards only inches away. And so he lived to see the Americans come in early May, and what was it, April anyway, and he then put himself at the service of the American commander as an interpreter.
Right, right. I mean, that was not a typical destination for I mean, certainly it was extraordinarily rare for British soldiers to be military personnel to be put into a
Yes,
concentration.
oh yes, no, it was. I mean, now you mention the subject, I must tell you that when I wrote the book, I met the last British soldier who had been in Buchenwald, and it turned out that a contingent of prisoners of war had been sent to Buchenwald by mistake, and the British and New Zealand, and they couldn't imagine what they saw when they arrived at Little Camp and had to lay out on a sort of pile of rocks and watch the misery and the half life around them. And Christopher, with one or two others, managed to get a letter out, possibly even up as far as Goebbels and Goering, sorry. And in any event, they returned to a prisoner of war camp. So he was then left alone with other captured resistance men from Canada and Britain, and they were all executed in a
Right.
horrible way, apart from two who escaped, and Christopher, who had been on his own. He wasn't one of the mass, one of the group. He was on his own. He'd been there already for several months. So Christopher saw what happened. His best friend was executed. Actually, it was a terrible, terrible time,
Right.
and he actually. Sorry if I'm going on a bit. I
No,
must
no,
tell you, was
it's a fascinating story, and I'm so glad
he
you included it in the book.
yeah, he wrote a letter to Julia, his soon to be his wife, who stood by him throughout the war. And I must say, Juliet knows this far better than me because she helped write it. But Julia wrote a kind of memoir of her time with Christopher. And Christopher didn't know that at the time. But Christopher wrote her a long letter, which of course he couldn't send her, but he disguised it in his clothes. So when he got out, the letter survived. And it's a terrible creed occur. He wrote in the winter of January 1945, when he all but died of cold. And he, of course, he longed for Julia, and he longed for the border country round where he lived after the war, where I live now. And that letter from Buchenwald, we call it, is now part of my book. I could go on, Brad, but that's
No,
probably.
no, it's fascinating, and I have to say, every time I read that uh, little excerpt from Julia's account of their reunion,
Oh,
and knowing what I mean, she, of course, had so little insight at that moment into, the depth of deprivation and horrors that he had seen.
no.
But if anybody was to ever film that, it would choke up everybody in the
Well,
audience. It's
it,
such a
it,
moving
it
moment.
chokes me every time. Because
Yes,
he had the American commandant at Buchenwald, he was able to get a lift on an American plane just 3 days after the liberation of the camp, having given a crucial interview to the BBC, which is one of the first times the BBC public knew about the concentration camps.
right.
The interview with Christopher outside Buchenwald. And anyway, he gets to lift back on the plane, and he rings Julia up, and she's at work as a secretary, and they agree to meet. And she says, "Oh God, it's Christopher, it's Christopher. I've just said, let's have lunch at St. James's Place, where that's already taking it in."
Right.
And
Right.
then they meet and he looks a complete mess because he's suffering from what we now call beriberi. He's bloated with semi-starvation, and he's wearing extraordinary homemade boots with matchsticks sticking out at the end to absorb the water. And she says, "Where have you been?" He says, "It'll take too long to say.
Right.
Are you married?" And she says, "No." And then, oh, it's wonderful. It's getting quite carried
No,
away.
it's such
Awesome.
a beautiful moment. I want to stop here and bring
Yeah.
in Peter if we can to talk about life and tell us a little bit about Christopher Burney, your father's life afterwards and the writing of the book and also kind of the struggles that he faced afterwards.
Right. Well, you've almost got the introduction to the next chapter from Hugh. And of course, we were pretty out of it for the first bit. But he got a job initially with the United Nations. So he went out as the assistant to a man called Adrian Pelt, who was a Dutch Jew who had been part of the Dutch government in exile in London. And he was one of the first assistants to the first Director General. So my father went and did that, and they lived in America for about 4 years. I think they had a wonderful time, and of course, huge contrast, not just from Buchenbach, but even from London. It was a land of plenty, and lights were on, and everybody was well fed. So they did that for a while, and then he came back. He became a banker for a while, which is my first sort of memory of him. And we moved out to Hertfordshire, and he commuted in and worked for one of the subsidiaries of Warburg's Bank, which was called the British and French Bank, which was a combination of a French bank and Warburg, which was meant to be providing capital for projects in French West Africa. So he did that for a bit. And then he really started in the sort of mid-60s. He started to have serious reactions to his life in the war. So what sort of a person was he? I mean, he was very affectionate. He was always very affectionate. He was quite sociable in those days, in the early days when we were living in Hertfordshire rather. My parents had tennis parties, and he used to play cricket on the green, and they used to have the village in for drinks after church. He was quite sociable, but he was also liked his own space as well. So we were very carefully marshaled by my mother not to pester him, which we would have done all day long if we could have done. So she kept, and he had a study, and he worked in there. He read a lot and was trying to write or prepare new editions of things. And he was writing Descent from Ararat. He read very widely, mostly in French. So he read the classics like Montaigne, the modern, what were then modern, Albert Camus and Jean Giono, and philosophy. He read the enormous tome of Etienne Gilson on Thomism.
Mm-hmm.
And with me, he did sort of ordinary dad things, really. We went fishing all over the place, to Ireland. We never caught any fish, but we went in the hope. So we went to Ireland. We went to France a couple of times, and we took a car trip down to Naples. He taught me when we went to Herefordshire, which is where Hugh lives now. He taught me to read a map and locate myself on a map using a compass, and showed me how to bisect a line with a compass, and showed me some of the defense maneuvers that he was taught with the commandos and with SOE, which of course was thrilling to a 13-year-old. So he did those sorts of things. Though again, we were always told by my mother, don't, in the phrase of John Cleese, don't mention the war. I mean, we were very much, that was taboo. I wasn't allowed to ask him how many Germans he'd killed and other things that would have been very interesting to me at that age. I think beyond that, he then became much more reclusive, and he went off and lived in Paris. He started by thinking that he would do some journalism, and got a contract from the Telegraph to go, Sunday Telegraph, I think, to go and do a piece on Guatemala, and he went out and stayed with my godfather out there. But that never got turned in, so that's a missing masterpiece. He did have panic attacks. So once when we were in skiing in St. Moritz, he unexpectedly, I don't know why it should be of unexpected in St. Moritz, but he heard German spoken very loudly behind him, and he had a panic attack and had to go back to the hotel and lie down. And he had he didn't respond well to men in uniforms. I mean, I remember being flagged down by an Irish Gardaí when we were off fishing in Ireland, and you could tell he was extremely tense. But then he went off to live in France. He was always still affectionate and glad to see us, but he was more and more living a sort of more isolated life, which again is fairly typical of people with PTSD. So I suppose.
Well, he was really, I mean, we say, I mean, you introduced the term
Yeah.
PTSD. Now that's part of our lingua franca, and we sort of anticipate that men and women who come out of wartime situations or other, experiences of tremendous stress will have psychological baggage and have to deal with that. But that was just really not neither recognized or sort of socially accepted for the veterans of World War II, certainly.
So you're completely right. And he was debriefed by an RAMC psychiatrist when he got back. And he was pretty thoroughly picked off with that. Apart from the fact that this was obviously some kind of Freudian psychoanalyst. And they kept asking him, well, what fantasies did he have when he was what dreams did he have in Buchenwald? And the correct answer, according to the psychiatrist, would be sexual fantasies. And my father, who was half starved, the only thing he dreamt of was a whole conveyor belt of fried eggs. That's what he dreamed of.
Right.
So you're right, it wasn't understood. I think it might have been more understood on the continent a bit earlier than here. But even then, I think it was only written up really quite late.
Right.
And I don't know whether he could have been helped by some kind of psychiatric treatment. But I think it's probably not very easy to manage anyway.
No. And I appreciate Hugh and your piece that you mentioned the really pioneering Polish study, which
Yeah,
was kind of like the first statistical
yeah,
study of a substantial base of survivors of that. And particularly in light of Descent from Ararat, which is a fascinating piece to look at in the context of PTSD. Do you
yeah.
think that that was in part a reflection of what we'd call survivor guilt now?
Um, what the Descent from Ararat?
Yeah.
The Descent from Ararat is an essay, a long essay. It's been called a fable and allegory. I think Christopher called it a long story, um, in which a man who breaks an ankle is trapped on a mountain ledge, and he's lost his memory, and he's thinking of suicide. And a stranger comes along, and they spend the night talking, and then the stranger helps them get down off the mountain. And what they talk about is suicide, is the existence of God, is whether or not life is worth living. And I'm sure the key to that essay is that both the stranger and the man with the broken ankle are Christopher, his ego and his alter ego. And his alter ego is seeking for what should he. This ego wants to end his life, and the alter ego, the stranger, is saying, "That's actually it's a wonderful essay, but you don't have to believe in God. Don't try and prove it. Just accept. Just believe in the kind of certainties like beauty and love, and stop being so full of angst and self-questioning. And suicide's not going to get you anywhere at all. And look down the mountain, and the sun is coming up, and life is good. And then the stranger goes off, and he goes down, and like Noah, when the receding water, hence Descent from Ararat, he begins life again. That's the idea. It didn't work that way, because uh, shortly afterwards, after that, he became seriously disturbed. And I must just tell you one particular episode. Um, his brother, Roger, was a friend of Benjamin Britten's. And Benjamin Britten dedicated the War Requiem to Roger Burney and two or three others. And of course, therefore, Benjamin Britten invited Christopher to attend an early performance of the War Requiem. And it was too much for Christopher, according to Julia. He just couldn't take it. And it was Julia wrote to Benjamin Britten. We discovered a letter saying it's absolutely freaked him out. He can't write. He can hardly even think about it. And shortly afterwards, he disappeared to this French village where he lived on his own, only with a dog, for over a year or two, I think it was, maybe more. So that was a key incident. But Descent from Ararat, I think, is a story about post-traumatic stress, and a very revealing essay. Short
Yeah.
essay, very revealing.
Right, right. No, I mean, agree, and I'm glad we included it with solitary confinement because in the context of Christopher's story as you tell it, the piece resonates, I think, so powerfully.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, it possibly the reviewers didn't understand it because they hadn't read Solitary Confinement. A lot
Yes.
of it goes back to Solitary Confinement and his ponderings in his cell for week after week, month after month, endlessly about good, evil, and God, and tying himself in knots because he couldn't write anything down, and he didn't have any books to start with. And he
Hmm.
was sort of self-taught. He was a bit of an autodidact. He left school when he was 16. So he admits that a lot of his sort of philosophical meanderings don't get anywhere, but he's pondering these huge issues. And that is what kept him alive and gave him this kind of, as he put it in the words, contemplating the far horizons of existence, as he
Hmm.
no longer had to bother about daily living. And so that's what he was doing. And I think it's quite remarkable. I can hardly actually conceive it, because I mean, 520 days solitary confinement is absolutely kind of, I mean, today, under these maximum prisons in America, at least they let you out for exercise and make
Right.
sure you're given a decent diet. I mean, he had neither of those. I mean, I think it's quite remarkable he survived.
It's remarkable, and I think particularly also because, you know, he, as you said, he wasn't a professional philosopher, if one can say something like that. He wasn't, you know,
No,
he hadn't you know,
no,
dealt extensively with philosophical or psychological or theological aspects of his situation.
no, no,
It's
no,
very,
indeed.
it's sort of do it yourself, working through reaching a state of mental peace, which is,
It
I
was
think, one
quite
of the
remarkable.
reasons why the book, you know, is so relevant even today.
Yes, indeed, I think it's relevant because, as one of the reviewers said, um, we we should ask ourselves how we would survive if we were completely on our own. A minimum of food and shelter, but that's all. We are on our own. How would we survive? And could we survive? How would we have the mental and emotional and indeed physical strength to do it? And that is why, instead of going into all the sort of detail of daring do and trying to escape and that kind of stuff you get in typical war stories, this is much more profound. I think we all agreed on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Peter, over the course of time, even though this book has been kind of in and out of press, out of print, off and on, I mean, have people come to you and express their feelings about encountering the book? Is this something that people recognize you as Christopher's son and find that connection?
A few, but as my father would have said, he didn't have very good luck with his publishers. So the
True.
book wasn't apart. I mean, um, uh, there was a big publicity splurge in the early 60s when it was first republished. And I was really too young for that to be of something that people would talk to me about. And my interest in those days, you know, as a sort of prep school boy, would be that, you know, much more interested in how many people my father didn't kill during the war.
Hmm.
But he was obviously a hero. I understood that, but I didn't really understand enough to have a. And since then, it's really been pretty much out of print. So no, people, not a lot of people, a few people do, but not a lot of people.
Well, I hope we
I
can
think,
start to
okay,
change that with this new edition
yeah,
coming out.
yes. But going back to what Hugh was saying about Descent from Ararat, I mean, I reread it in its short version in the new edition, and it did strike me that there was quite a lot of continuation from solitary confinement, and it becomes even more um, in favor of something that is a sort of anti-metaphysics. So not to bother about the whys and wherefores, but life is for living rather than for thinking about. I think
Yeah,
that would be a message that I would get. And hence the reference to Noah, who
Mm.
after the flood was told to plant his vineyards and get on with life. Uh, and I think that was probably his sort of last thought on that.
no, I agree. He says something, the alter ego says, the stranger says, um, think that you're sitting outside on a summer's day and look around you and accept the verities that just don't question, accept beauty, accept love, accept God, and then go on and live. And that, if only Christopher had been able to do that, he would have lived forever and ever. But there we are.
Yes.
Well, it's a daily, even if you make that decision, if you take that decision to, it never stops being a daily struggle because our minds do tend to try to grapple with problems of the world and problems of our own family and friends and acquaintances.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on, but just to relate back to solitary confinement, I do believe I'm so pleased you will have republished it, because I think it's one of the great books to come out of the war. Rebecca West said it's one of the most important books to be written for the last 20 years. And so I hope that people buy it.
I hope so as well. So we're coming up to the hour here. I just want to offer, if anyone in the audience wants to come off of mute and ask any questions of the three of us, we certainly want to make that available. Hopefully, if you haven't read Solitary Confinement, you'll get it because I think, as we've tried to attest, it is such a remarkable book, and such a compact book too. In other words, it's not a long-winded philosophical tome. It really does deal with things in a very succinct and sort of intensely observant fashion. That a lot of ways, and I think Ted Joy sort of touches on that, but it is one of the most Zen-like books one can find. I mean, there are many places where the sort of spirituality that he talks about and distancing from experience is similar to what a Buddhist, Zen Buddhist, tries to achieve in their own life. And yet he had no, that wasn't a point of reference for him at all. And yet he kind of reached the same sort of destination from a much different different path.
Well, okay. I think we'll if there are no
Sorry, my mother wanted to say a quick thing.
Oh, thank you so much.
No, that's what I wanted to say. I've been trying to figure out how to get the book republished for a long time, and then you came along and you sort of saved me a whole lot of work.
Well, I'm very grateful. For those in the audience who don't know, this is Juliet Patton, who is Christopher Burney's daughter. And Juliet, we worked with to obtain the rights to republish the book. And so we're just thrilled that this all came together.
And Hugh had a great deal to do with that too. He and Margaret were fantastic. And I've got another story. But like my brother, I remember everyone was smoking, when you were in your late teens and things. And on one of the rare occasions we sort of were together, I sort of went, because all my friends were being bribed not to smoke until they were 21. And I said to my father, well, if I just promise not to smoke until I'm 21, would you give me £100? And he said, if you want to smoke, you smoke. And that was it. No £100 for me. But he was a wonderful man, and very gentle and very kind. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Brad, I know Juliet asked me a question, and I didn't know the answer. I've got a copy of the book here. We're expecting 7 lines for a week, but in fact there are 5. Any reason for that?
Oh, well, yeah, but mainly because that's the way in which one would typically count. You know, he didn't know he was going to measure his time in weeks, but certainly in days, and that's a typical way of doing it. Really, it was the designer, Louise Aspinall, came up with that idea, and as soon as she sent me the first draft of it, I
Good.
thought, oh, yeah,
Mm.
it's perfect.
Good. Thank you for answering that.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us, and I welcome you to find the book. Ask for it at your local bookshop. If you're in the UK, it's available now, and it's certainly available in the US as well through all the major outlets, as well as our own distributor, Asterism Books. I encourage you to check it out. I think it's a book that's still phenomenally relevant for today's world. We're dealing, and especially us in America, are dealing in a time of tremendous uncertainty and doubt and not knowing what the next day holds for us. And that was Christopher Burney's life for 526 days in Friend Prison, and he certainly offers us today ideas on how to deal with this kind of quandary in a human and responsive way. So thank you all for joining us, and this will be posted to the UEA Publishing Project YouTube channel, and I hope if you weren't able to join us today, that others will be able to watch the video and benefit from this tremendous book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.